The probate courtroom was quiet except for the sound of HOA President Sylvia Marrow signing the final page of an estate sale agreement. Her attorney sliding the notarized death certificate across the table as proof the property's rightful owner, Walter Kim, was no longer alive to object to anything. The doors at the back of the room opened. Sylvia didn't look up right away, not until the room went still around her, until she noticed her own attorney's pen stop moving mid-signature. When she finally turned, Walter Kim, sun-weathered, 30 pounds lighter and very much alive, was walking straight toward the table where a piece of paper claimed his heart had stopped 4 months earlier. Sylvia's pen slipped out of her fingers and rolled off the table before she could say a single word. Stay with Walter as one forged document unravels into a scheme that had already stolen more than just his property. It had tried to erase him entirely. Walter Kim was 66 years old, a retired shipbuilder who had spent 40 years building hulls for a regional shipyard before retiring to a modest waterfront cottage in Cedar Point Landing, a small coastal HOA community his late wife, Grace, had loved more than any place they'd ever lived. When Grace died the previous year, Walter made a decision that surprised even his own daughter. He was going to finish the sailboat he and Grace had always talked about restoring and take it out on the solo voyage they'd always meant to do together. Before leaving, Walter did everything responsibly. He placed the cottage in a revocable trust with his daughter, Mina, as successor trustee, notified the HOA board in writing that he'd be gone roughly 4 to 6 months on an open ocean voyage with limited satellite communication, and prepaid a full year of HOA dues in advance specifically to avoid any complications while he was away. Sylvia Marrow, HOA president, signed the acknowledgement of his notice herself. Sylvia Marrow was 54 years old, a former commercial real estate broker who had wanted Walter's small waterfront parcel for over 2 years. Ever since she'd realized it was the only lot in Cedar Point Landing with direct water access not already built up. Land, she believed, correctly, could be combined with the adjoining HOA-owned green space to create a private marina clubhouse that would dramatically raise property values across the entire community, and her own home's value along with it. She had approached Walter twice about selling, both times politely, both times declined, since the cottage had been Grace's favorite place in the world and Walter had no intention of parting with it. Sylvia had not taken either refusal well. She told her husband after the second conversation that Walter was sitting on a fortune he doesn't even appreciate, a comment her husband would later recall clearly under oath. When Walter's satellite check-ins went quiet for 6 weeks longer than expected, a stretch that was, in reality, caused by a badly damaged mast forcing him to limp toward a remote refueling port for repairs, Sylvia saw not a delay, but an opening. She reached out to a records clerk she knew socially through her husband's law firm, a man named Dale Petrosky who processed vital records filings in a neighboring county, and asked him, framing it as a time-sensitive estate matter, whether a death certificate could be generated for someone who had died at sea, without immediate next-of-kin notification. Dale, who had processed exactly this kind of paperwork legitimately dozens of times for actual maritime deaths, agreed to help Sylvia file one that was anything but legitimate, generating a death certificate citing presumed cardiac arrest at sea, using a template pulled from a real, unrelated case, altering the name, date, and vessel registration number to match Walter's, and backdating it to align with his last confirmed satellite check-in. Armed with the forged certificate, Sylvia filed an emergency petition with the county probate court, representing herself as a concerned community stakeholder requesting appointment as a special administrator to manage the abandoned estate, pending location of legitimate heirs. Deliberately omitting any mention of Mina Kim, the daughter Sylvia knew perfectly well existed and had met at community events more than once. Constance Reed, Walter's 71-year-old next-door neighbor and one of the few people he'd shared his actual satellite messaging details with, noticed a probate notice posted on Walter's front door referring to the estate of the deceased, and immediately knew something was deeply wrong, because she had received a message from Walter's satellite device just 11 days earlier confirming he was alive, delayed, and en route to a repair port. Constance called Mina Kim directly, and Mina, horrified, discovered that not only had she never been notified of any death, she had never been notified of any probate filing at all, despite being listed as successor trustee on the very trust document that should have made any of this legally impossible to begin with, had anyone bothered to check the county recorder's office first. Mina sat in her car in a grocery store parking lot for nearly 20 minutes after the call ended, unable to make herself start the engine, replaying every satellite message her father had sent over the past months. Proof, sitting right there on her phone, that the piece of paper claiming he was dead was simply, provably wrong. What frightened her more than the fraud itself was how close it had come to working without her ever knowing it was happening at all. Mina retained an estate litigation attorney named Marissa Voigt, who requested the full probate file within hours and found something immediately, glaringly wrong. The death certificate Sylvia had filed carried a vital records case number that, when cross-checked against the state's actual electronic filing system, belonged to a completely different, unrelated case from 11 months earlier. An elderly man who had, in fact, died peacefully in a hospital, nowhere near open water. Marissa's paralegal, digging further into the same clerk's office, found 2 other property transfers in neighboring counties over the past 3 years that had used unusually similar language: presumed death, no immediate next-of-kin notification, special administrator appointment. Both involving elderly, temporarily unreachable property owners, and both eventually resulting in property sales to shell companies that traced back, through layers of paperwork, to addresses associated with Dale Petrosky's extended family. One case involved a retired schoolteacher who had spent 3 months in a rehabilitation facility after a stroke, unreachable by phone during recovery, whose modest lake cabin had been sold within weeks of a nearly identical presumed death, filing before her own son even learned what had happened. The other involved a widower who had gone to stay with relatives overseas for an extended visit. Neither victim had ever been criminally deceased. Both had simply been, for a period of time, difficult to reach, which Marissa realized with a cold clarity, was precisely the vulnerability the scheme had been built to exploit. Marissa tracked down the retired schoolteacher, now recovered and living with her son 2 states away, who told her, still visibly shaken years later, that she had assumed the loss of her cabin was simply bad luck, a technicality in probate law she hadn't understood well enough to fight. "I thought I'd just been careless," the woman said. "I didn't know someone had actually done this on purpose." Hearing that, Marissa understood the case had grown far beyond Walter Kim alone. With the fraudulent probate case moving toward a court-approved estate sale in just under 3 weeks, and Walter still at sea completing mast repairs with no reliable timeline for return, Marissa filed an emergency motion to halt the sale, citing the mismatched case number and the existence of a living, documented successor trustee the court had never been properly notified about. The judge granted a temporary stay pending review, a development that rattled Sylvia far more than she let on to her own board. She had already lined up a buyer for the property, a shell LLC called Marrow Coastal Holdings that, if anyone had bothered to check the state business registry, listed Sylvia's own husband as registered agent. Investigator Tobias Lund, brought in by the state's Consumer Protection Division after Marissa formally reported the mismatched death certificate, traced the vital records login used to generate Walter's forged certificate directly to Dale Petrosky's individual employee credentials, timestamped to a login session that occurred less than an hour after a phone call from Sylvia Marrow's personal cell phone. Walter Kim's sailboat limped into the harbor 11 days after the temporary stay was granted, mast patched, sunburned and exhausted but alive, and Constance Reed was waiting at the dock with news that made him drop his mooring line mid-motion. Someone had tried to have him declared dead to take his house, and the rescheduled hearing to finalize or unwind. Everything was happening in less than 48 hours. Sylvia Marrow arrived at the rescheduled hearing confident the delay had simply been procedural, unaware that Marissa now had Tobias Lund's full investigative report, Dale Petrosky's login records, and the Shell LLC paperwork listing her own husband as registered agent, and completely unaware that Walter himself had made it back in time to attend in person. When the courtroom doors opened and Walter Kim walked in, alive, sun-darkened, and utterly unmistakable, Sylvia's carefully rehearsed composure dissolved in real time. Her pen slipping from her fingers mid-signature, her face draining of color as the man she had declared dead on paper stood not 30 feet away, very clearly capable of speaking for himself. Under questioning, Dale Petrosky, facing the loss of his job, his pension, and potential criminal charges, cooperated fully, confirming Sylvia's original phone call, the altered case number, and the 2 prior properties acquired through similar filings. Sylvia's attorney, blindsided by information his own client hadn't disclosed to him, requested a recess that did nothing to change what the judge had already seen with his own eyes. The court voided the entire probate proceeding, restored full ownership to Walter and the trust, and referred both Sylvia Marrow and Dale Petrosky for criminal prosecution on forgery, fraud, and identity theft charges. A subsequent civil suit filed by Walter, joined by the two other affected families Tobias Lund had identified, resulted in a combined judgment, restitution, punitive damages, and legal costs, totaling $2,850,000, along with Sylvia's permanent removal from any future HOA leadership role in the state and the dissolution of Marrow Coastal Holdings. The retired schoolteacher's family used part of their restitution to help her move somewhere closer to them, closing a chapter she said she'd never fully believed would resolve in her favor. Dale Petrosky, cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence, lost his position and his pension, telling investigators in his final statement that he had told himself each time that he was just filling out a form. A rationalization he admitted that had gotten easier every time he used it, right up until it didn't. Months later, Walter stood on his dock finishing repairs to the same sailboat, Constance Reed sitting nearby with 2 cups of coffee, watching the water the way she had every morning while he was gone. Mina visited most weekends now, bringing her own kids down to the water the way she had as a child. Walter told Constance, half joking, that he supposed he was one of the few people who could say he'd technically survived his own death, and then, more quietly, that the whole ordeal had taught him something he hadn't expected to learn at 66. That the people most eager to write you off are sometimes the ones who most need you gone, and that showing up alive in person is sometimes the only argument that actually works. If you've ever had someone try to weaponize against you, leave a comment below. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it ended. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.